I used to believe silence was peaceful, hahaha, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts settle, but that morning it felt different, heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath and waiting for bad news to arrive. And I remember standing in the kitchen staring at my mug of coffee, already cold even though I had just poured it, thinking how strange it was that time could move forward while life stayed stuck in the same quiet loop, day after day. Sigh. Wake up alone, rinse a cup, water the plants, glance at old photographs without really looking at them, tell myself I was fine, tell myself this was normal, because when you're a mother whose child slowly drifts away, you learn to normalize absence like it's some kind of survival skill, and that morning felt exactly like all the others, calm on the surface, hollow underneath, until my phone lit up on the counter, not ringing yet, just glowing softly like it was testing whether I was ready, and my son's name was on the screen. And isn't it funny how one name can still make your chest tighten even after all the unanswered calls and delayed replies? Even after all the times you told yourself you wouldn't expect anything anymore. I stared at that screen longer than I should have, arguing silently with myself, thinking maybe it was just a casual check-in. Maybe he finally remembered, maybe today would be different, and when I finally answered, my voice sounded steadier than I felt, because mothers learn early how to hide cracks, and he spoke like nothing in the world was wrong, casual, distracted. Like he was already halfway somewhere else, and I asked him something simple, something innocent, something a mother should be allowed to ask without fear. I asked about the wedding dinner, just that, not demanding, not accusing, just curious. Because last I knew the date was still being decided, and there was a pause on the other end, short but sharp, the kind that tells you you've stepped into a place you weren't meant to go, and then he said it, so easily, so casually. Like he was telling me the weather, Mom, it was yesterday, and for a second my mind refused to process the words, ha ha ha, like when you reread the same sentence again and again because it doesn't make sense, yesterday. My heart echoed it back to me, yesterday, as if the calendar on the wall suddenly became a stranger, and before I could even breathe around that word, he added, only important people were invited. And that was the moment the silence broke inside me, not with a scream, not with tears, but with something colder, something that sank straight down into my bones, important people. Sigh, I repeated it in my head, important people. And I didn't say anything out loud, because what do you say when your own child calmly places you outside the circle of importance, when he redraws the boundaries of his life and erases you with one sentence? And I stood there holding the phone, nodding even though he couldn't see me, doing what I had always done, absorbing the impact quietly so he wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable, and he kept talking. Explaining in that polished tone people use when they want to sound reasonable, talking about keeping things small, about wanting the right atmosphere, about how complicated weddings are. And I listened like a polite stranger instead of the woman who once stayed awake all night when he had a fever. And when the call ended, I stood in the same spot long after the screen went dark, the house still silent, the coffee still cold, the air suddenly too thin, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world hadn't stopped, that the clock was still ticking even though something essential had just been taken from me, and I told myself, don't overreact. Don't make this about you, he's grown now, this is his life. And I tried to convince myself that not being invited didn't mean I didn't matter, that it was just one event, just one day, that love doesn't need invitations, ha ha ha. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about a wedding. It was about position, about rank, about where I stood in the story he was telling the world about himself, and that realization crept in slowly, like a bruise that doesn't show until later. And over the next few days, I moved through my routine like a ghost, folding laundry, sweeping floors, smiling at neighbors, all while that sentence replayed in my head, only important people. And each time it replayed, it sounded less like an explanation and more like a verdict, and I wondered when that happened, when I went from being his foundation to being background noise, when my role shifted from mother to inconvenience. And I didn't call him back, I didn't text, I didn't ask questions, because part of me was afraid of what the answers would confirm, and another part was tired of reaching first, tired of pretending that silence didn't hurt. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into the small spaces he allowed me, and one week passed like that, slow and heavy, every day stretching longer than the last, until the phone lit up again, same name, same glow. And this time my chest tightened for a different reason, because something in me already knew this call wasn't about love or apology or explanation, it was about need, and as I stared at that screen, finger hovering, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes right before a storm, and I answered, and before he even finished his first sentence, before the urgency in his voice fully revealed itself, before the number he was about to say changed everything, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before, that the wedding wasn't the real betrayal, it was just the beginning. And whatever he was about to ask next would force me to finally decide whether I was still just his mother or simply his last option. After that call ended, I told myself I would move on, ha ha ha, like people do when they want to sound strong. But strength is funny that way. It doesn't arrive when you demand it. It arrives when you're too tired to fight what you're feeling. And that night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying his words again and again, only important people, as if maybe repetition would soften them, but each time they landed sharper, heavier sigh. And I kept wondering how a sentence so short could rearrange an entire lifetime, because suddenly every memory felt different, every sacrifice slightly distorted. Like I had been reading the same book for years and only now noticed the footnotes were missing my name. And the next morning I woke up with swollen eyes and pretended it was allergies. Because pretending has always been easier than explaining pain that doesn't have a neat reason. And as the days passed, I started noticing things I had ignored before, little patterns that made uncomfortable sense. Like how invitations stopped coming a while ago, how conversations became shorter, how I was always the one asking questions and never the one being asked. And I realized that the wedding wasn't some sudden decision. It was just the moment I finally saw the truth clearly, that I had been quietly phased out long before the ceremony ever happened, and I remembered times I had brushed off as nothing. Like the engagement party where I was seated near the kitchen, smiling through conversations that never quite included me, or holidays where plans were still up in the air until they somehow happened without me. And I remembered telling myself not to take it personally, telling myself he was busy, telling myself love doesn't always look the same as it used to, but now that phrase echoed louder than any excuse I had ever made for him. Only important people, and it made me ask a question I had avoided for too long. When did I stop being important? Was it gradual, like a light slowly dimming? Or was it the moment I stopped being useful in ways that impressed others, and the thought made my chest ache, because usefulness is such a fragile form of love. It disappears the moment you no longer fit the image someone wants to present to the world, and I wondered what the wedding looked like, not because I wanted to be there anymore, but because my mind kept filling the silence with pictures I hadn't asked for, him standing proud, smiling for cameras, surrounded by people who probably didn't know the sound of his laugh as a child or the way he used to hold my hand crossing the street, and the idea that all of that happened without me felt surreal. Like finding out a chapter of your life was published without your permission, ha ha ha, and I asked myself if I should have reacted differently, if I should have cried on the phone, demanded answers, made him uncomfortable the way he had made me uncomfortable. But I didn't, because somewhere deep down I had already learned that discomfort only ever flows one way in relationships like this, and over that week, I became painfully aware of how quiet my house was, how loud memories can be when there's no one left to interrupt them, and I would catch myself doing things out of habit, setting aside leftovers I knew I wouldn't eat, glancing at the door when I heard a sound outside, only to laugh softly at myself afterward, ha ha ha, because habits outlive relevance, and maybe that's what hurt most. Realizing that I was still living like someone who mattered in his daily life, while he had already adjusted to a version of the world where I existed somewhere on the edge, and every night before sleep, I would tell myself the same thing. Tomorrow I'll stop thinking about it, tomorrow I'll let it go, tomorrow I'll accept that this is just how things are now, but tomorrow kept arriving with the same unanswered heaviness, and I noticed something else too. Something subtle but impossible to ignore once I saw it. The guilt never came from him. Not once did he ask how I felt, not once did he wonder if I was okay, and that absence said more than any apology ever could. Because when someone doesn't even ask if they hurt you, it means they already decided your pain is manageable, and that realization made my throat tighten in a way that surprised me. Because I had always believed that no matter how far apart we grew, that invisible thread between a mother and child would still tug when one of us was hurting. But that week proved otherwise, and by the sixth day, something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet rearranging of expectations, like furniture being moved in a dark room, and I stopped waiting for a follow-up call that would never come. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes. I stopped rehearsing conversations that wouldn't happen, and I told myself, this is it. This is the new normal, accept it and survive it. And I might have stayed in that numb acceptance much longer if the phone hadn't rung again on the seventh day, his name lighting up the screen once more. But this time, the energy felt different before I even answered, heavier, urgent. Like the calm before had only existed to make what came next hit harder, and as I lifted the phone, I felt a strange mix of dread and clarity, because part of me already understood that this call wasn't about the wedding anymore. It wasn't about explanations or reconciliation. It was about something else entirely, something that would finally expose why I had been excluded in the first place, and as I took a slow breath and answered, I had no idea what number he was about to say, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever he needed now would force me to see exactly what role I still played in his life, and whether that role was worth keeping. I didn't notice it at first, hahaha, because patterns only become obvious when you stop defending them. But once that thought settled in my mind, everything I had ignored for years started lining up like quiet evidence. And suddenly the wedding wasn't a surprise anymore. It was just the loudest example of something that had been happening slowly, politely, almost kindly. As if distance had been wrapped in soft excuses so I wouldn't feel the cut until it was deep, and I began replaying moments I had brushed off as nothing, moments I had forgiven before they even became apologies, sigh. Like the times he said he'd call back and never did, the holidays that were too hectic to plan together, the dinners that were always postponed until they somehow happened without me, and I remembered how often I had told myself, he's busy, he's building his life, this is what independence looks like. But now those explanations felt flimsy, like paper shields I had held up to avoid seeing the truth. Because independence doesn't require erasing the person who made it possible, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully I had been repositioned in his life, not pushed away violently. Just quietly relocated to a place where I wouldn't interfere, where I wouldn't embarrass him, where I wouldn't remind anyone of where he came from. And that realization hurt in a strange, dull way, not like a sharp wound, but like pressure on a bruise you didn't know was there until someone touched it, and I started remembering the engagement announcement, how I found out through a forwarded message instead of a call, how he sounded surprised when I said congratulations, like he hadn't expected emotion from me anymore, and the engagement party itself, how I stood there holding a small gift, watching him laugh with people whose names I didn't know, people who spoke about vacations and investments while I smiled and nodded, pretending I belonged in conversations that felt like closed rooms. And I remembered how I was guided to a table near the back, near the kitchen, with a soft explanation about space and seating. And I remembered telling myself it was fine, that it didn't matter where I sat as long as he was happy, hahaha. But now I could see it clearly. That placement wasn't about space, it was about hierarchy, and I had accepted my position without question, because mothers are taught early that love means stepping back, that sacrifice is quiet. That dignity sometimes looks like silence, and maybe that's why he learned so easily that I wouldn't protest, that I would absorb discomfort rather than cause it, and the thought made my chest tighten. Because I realized I had trained him without meaning to, trained him to believe my feelings were flexible, negotiable, always secondary to his comfort. And over that week, as the house stayed quiet and the days blurred together, I began asking myself uncomfortable questions, not about him, but about me, like when did I stop expecting respect? When did I decide that being included was optional? When did love turn into something I had to earn repeatedly? And the answers weren't flattering, sigh, because they pointed back to moments when I chose peace over truth, when I smiled instead of speaking up, when I convinced myself that asking for basic consideration was selfish. And I realized how often I had minimized my own presence just to keep the connection alive. And maybe that's why being excluded from the wedding hurt the way it did, not just because I wasn't there, but because it confirmed something I had been afraid to admit, that in his new world I didn't add value, I added history, and history can be inconvenient when you're trying to look impressive, and that thought lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. As I moved through my days, folding clothes slowly, staring out the window longer than usual, sighing at small things I couldn't explain, and I found myself laughing quietly at how predictable it all was in hindsight, hahaha. How I had been shocked by something that had been quietly rehearsed for years, and I wondered if he even realized what he was doing, or if it felt normal to him, if in his mind this wasn't cruelty but efficiency. A necessary adjustment as his life upgraded, and that idea scared me more than anger ever could, because it meant the distance wasn't personal, it was strategic, and strategy leaves little room for guilt. And one evening, as I sat alone with the television playing softly in the background, not really watching, I caught myself reaching for my phone to text him something meaningless, just to feel connected, and I stopped halfway, my finger hovering. Because for the first time, I asked myself why. Why was I still reaching out when he hadn't reached back? Why was I still trying to prove relevance to someone who had already decided where I stood? And that pause felt heavier than any argument we could have had. Because it was the moment I realized how much effort I had been spending to maintain a relationship that now required constant self-erasure, and I set the phone down, feeling both sad and strangely relieved, because clarity, even painful clarity, has a way of calming the mind, and I told myself, maybe this is the end of this chapter, maybe acceptance is the answer. Maybe I just need to adjust my expectations and move on, and for a brief moment, I believed that. I believed I could settle into this quieter role without resentment, but life has a way of testing conclusions. And just when I thought the worst thing had already happened, just when I thought exclusion was the deepest cut I would have to process, the phone rang again, breaking the stillness like a crack through glass, and as I looked at his name glowing on the screen, I felt a tightness in my stomach that had nothing to do with longing anymore, because something told me this call wasn't about family, it wasn't about reconciliation, it wasn't even about regret, it was about need. And as I answered, listening to the urgency creep into his voice, I realized the wedding hadn't been the moment I was pushed aside, it was the moment I was repositioned. And whatever he was about to ask next would reveal exactly why I had been moved, and whether I was finally ready to stop playing the role he had quietly written for me. The moment I heard his voice that second time, I knew this call wasn't about me, ha ha ha, it had that sharp edge to it, that rushed energy people get when they need something badly and don't want to sound desperate. And before he even finished saying hello, I could feel the urgency spilling through the phone, the way he spoke faster than usual, barely pausing between sentences, like time itself was chasing him, and he didn't ask how I was. Didn't mention the wedding again, didn't acknowledge the silence between us. He went straight to the point, Sai, because when people see you as a solution, small talk becomes unnecessary, and he said my name the way someone says a password. Quick and purposeful, and then he dropped it, the number clean and exact. Mom, I need $65,000. And for a second I actually laughed, ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because my mind couldn't connect that number to reality. It felt unreal, like something from a movie or a bad joke taken too far. 65,000. I repeated it silently, rolling it around in my head, and he kept talking. Explaining, justifying, filling the space so I wouldn't interrupt, saying it was urgent, saying it was temporary, saying it was just to fix a situation, and that word, situation, stuck with me because it was doing a lot of work. Hiding the truth under something vague and manageable, and I listened quietly because that's what I had always done, but inside something shifted, something cold and sharp, because suddenly the pattern made sense, the exclusion, the distance. The careful repositioning, it all lined up with this moment, with this ask. And I realized the wedding hadn't been about intimacy or atmosphere or important people at all. It had been about control, about appearances, about keeping certain people visible and others conveniently invisible until they were needed. And as he spoke, my eyes drifted to the small things around me, the worn edges of the table, the quiet clock on the wall, the house that had held every version of him growing up. And I thought about how casually he was asking me to hand over an amount of money that represented years of careful saving. Years of saying no to myself so I could say yes to him, and he talked about deadlines, about pressure, about how things would get complicated if the money didn't come through quickly, and not once did he ask if I could afford it. Not once did he hesitate, because somewhere along the way, my ability to give had become an assumption, and that realization hurt more than the number itself. Sigh, because numbers can be negotiated, but entitlement settles in deep. And I felt a strange mix of emotions rise up at once: shock, sadness, disbelief, and beneath it all, a quiet clarity, because now I understood my place in his life perfectly. I wasn't part of the celebration, but I was part of the cleanup. I wasn't important enough to witness the joy, but I was essential enough to fix the mess. And that thought made my chest tighten in a way that took my breath for a moment, and I had to sit down. Because suddenly the room felt too small, and he kept reassuring me, promising it would be paid back, promising it was just a short-term thing, promising things people promise when they're afraid the answer might be no. And I noticed how easily he said it, like returning the money was a formality, like my security was just a temporary inconvenience, and I wondered when that confidence replaced gratitude, when asking turned into expecting. When love quietly became leverage, and as he spoke, I realized something else too, something that made my hands tremble slightly. He wasn't embarrassed to ask, he wasn't ashamed, he was stressed that I might hesitate. Stressed that I might slow things down, and that told me everything, because if he truly saw me as his mother first, he would have been careful with this request, he would have softened it, he would have acknowledged the weight of it, but instead, he treated it like a transaction, like a problem to be solved quickly, and the more he talked, the quieter I became, because I needed that silence to think, to breathe, to feel the full weight of what was happening, and when there was finally a pause, just a brief one, I realized he was waiting for my automatic yes, waiting for the role I had played my entire life to activate on cue, and that was the moment everything slowed down. The moment I felt something settle deep inside me, not anger, not even hurt, but awareness, because in that pause I saw the truth clearly for the first time, that the wedding wasn't the betrayal and the money wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that somewhere along the way, my value in his life had been reduced to a number, and as I held the phone in my hand, listening to his breathing on the other end, I realized the answer I gave next wouldn't just decide what happened to that $65,000. It would decide who I was allowed to be from that moment on, and whether I was finally ready to stop being the silent solution to someone else's choices. When he finally stopped talking, when the explanations ran out and the silence stretched between us, my mind drifted backward without asking permission, ha ha ha, because memory has a cruel sense of timing. And suddenly I wasn't sitting there holding a phone anymore. I was standing in a tiny kitchen years ago, counting coins on the counter late at night, whispering numbers to myself so I wouldn't wake him. Because he needed new shoes for school, and I needed to pretend it was no trouble at all. And I remembered how proud I was back then, proud of being the one he could rely on, proud of making things work when they shouldn't have worked. Proud of telling myself that sacrifice was love and love was enough. And as he waited for my answer on the other end of the line, all those memories lined up like quiet witnesses, every extra shift, every delayed dream. Every time I chose his comfort over my own, and I remembered the nights I came home exhausted, feet aching, hands sore, only to sit beside his bed and listen to him talk about his day like it was the most important thing in the world. And back then it was, because he was my world, and I never questioned the cost, not once. I never kept score. Never imagined a day when those sacrifices would be invisible to him. And as these memories washed over me, I felt something warm and painful rise in my chest, a mixture of love and grief, because loving him had never been the mistake. But loving him without limits might have been. And I realized how often I had laughed things off, ha ha ha, when he forgot birthdays or showed up late or canceled plans, telling myself he didn't mean it, that life was busy, that children grow up and mothers adjust. But now I could see how those adjustments slowly taught him that my needs were optional, flexible, always movable. And the phone felt heavy in my hand as I remembered moments that used to make me smile, but now made my throat tighten, like the time he asked for help with tuition and promised he'd pay it back, or the time he needed a loan just for a few months, and how each time I said yes without hesitation, not because I had extra, but because I believed supporting him was my purpose, and somewhere along the way, that belief hardened into expectation on his side and obligation on mine. And as I sat there listening to my own breathing, I realized how tired I was, not physically, but emotionally, tired of being strong in silence. Tired of proving love through endurance, tired of being the safety net everyone assumed would always be there. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question, one I had avoided my entire life. What happens to me if I say no? And that question scared me, because it forced me to confront the possibility that my value in his life was conditional, tied to what I could provide rather than who I was. And that thought made my eyes sting, because no mother wants to believe her child sees her that way. And yet the evidence was right there in the urgency of his voice, in the lack of apology, in the way the wedding had happened without me, but the bill had somehow found its way to my phone, and I let out a slow breath, a long sigh that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside my chest, because suddenly everything made sense. The distance, the exclusion, the timing, it all pointed to one truth I hadn't wanted to accept, that my role had quietly shifted from mother to resource. And as painful as that realization was, it was also strangely clarifying. Because clarity strips away excuses, and in that moment, I understood that whatever I did next would set a precedent, not just for him, but for me, and that's when I want to pause for just a second. Because if you're listening to this and you've ever felt taken for granted by someone you love, if you've ever been valued more for what you give than for who you are, you're not alone. And stories like this don't end the same way unless we learn something from them. So if these moments feel uncomfortably familiar, stay with me. And if you want to hear more stories that speak the truth people are afraid to say out loud, make sure you're subscribed, because sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that finally set us free. And as I came back to the present, his voice still on the other end, waiting, I realized I hadn't answered yet, and that pause felt powerful. Because for once I wasn't rushing to reassure him. For once I wasn't filling the silence so he wouldn't feel uneasy. And in that quiet, I felt a small but steady shift inside me, like something realigning. And I thought about the future he was asking me to risk, my future, my security, my peace, all for a problem I hadn't created and a celebration I hadn't been invited to, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Not from sadness alone, but from the weight of finally seeing the truth clearly, and I wiped it away, steadying myself, because whatever answer I gave him would be shaped not by guilt or habit, but by the simple question I could no longer ignore. At what point does love stop meaning sacrifice and start meaning self-respect? And as I took a breath and prepared to speak, I knew that the next words out of my mouth would either keep me trapped in the same role I had always played, or finally draw a line I should have drawn a long time ago. And that decision, more than the money, was about to change everything. I stayed quiet a little longer, longer than what felt comfortable, because for the first time I wasn't trying to rescue him from his own anxiety, and that silence did something strange. It gave me space to hear my own thoughts instead of his urgency, and in that space I felt a line forming inside me, not loud, not dramatic, just firm, like something settling into place after years of being bent. And I realized I was standing at a point I had never allowed myself to reach before, the point where love and survival finally met face to face, and one of them had to stop pretending, because loving him had always come naturally. But protecting myself had always felt selfish, and now those two instincts were colliding, and I thought about what $65,000 really meant, not just as a number, but as time, as years of work. As nights I went to bed worried about bills, as mornings I chose practicality over comfort, and I imagined what would happen if I said yes, how the relief in his voice would last only a moment before the next expectation arrived. Because once you cross a line like that, there's always another line waiting, and I saw it clearly then. This wasn't a one-time emergency, it was a test of whether I would still sacrifice without question. And the thought made my stomach tighten, because I understood that if I agreed now, I would be agreeing not just to this request, but to the version of myself he expected me to remain forever, the quiet fallback. The uncomplaining solution, the person who absorbs consequences so he never has to feel them, and I asked myself something that surprised me with its honesty: would he still call me if I couldn't give him anything? And the answer came too quickly, too clearly, and it hurt more than any argument could have, because deep down I knew the call wouldn't have happened if there wasn't a problem to fix. And that realization stripped away the last layer of denial I had been clinging to, and I felt a strange calm replace the chaos in my chest, not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally understood it. And understanding changes how fear works, because once you name it, it loses some of its power, and I realized I wasn't afraid of losing his approval anymore. I was afraid of losing myself, of becoming someone who gave everything and still felt invisible, and that fear mattered more. And as he waited on the other end, probably checking the time, probably assuming my hesitation meant calculation instead of reflection, I looked around my house, really looked at the familiar walls, the quiet rooms, the life I had built piece by piece, and I understood that this place, this stability, this future had value too, even if it didn't impress anyone else. And I felt a lump rise in my throat as I thought about how often I had been told, directly or indirectly, that I didn't need much, that I should be grateful, that my needs were small, and I realized how dangerous that belief had been. Because it taught me to accept less than I deserved, and I took a slow breath, steadying my voice, because this wasn't about anger or punishment, it was about boundaries, something I had never practiced with him before. And I felt my heart ache even as my resolve strengthened, because drawing a line with someone you love feels like betrayal when you've been trained to give endlessly. And yet, for the first time, I understood that saying no didn't mean I loved him less. It meant I was finally loving myself enough to matter, and that distinction felt both terrifying and necessary. And when I finally spoke, my voice surprised me with its calm. Because it didn't shake, it didn't rush, it didn't apologize, it simply existed. And I realized in that moment that the power had already shifted, not because of what I was about to say, but because I was no longer afraid of the consequences. And as the words formed in my mind, clear and deliberate, I knew this wasn't just a response to a request, it was a declaration of where the line was drawn, and that line, once drawn, would change everything between us. Because once you stop being the automatic answer, people are forced to face their own choices. And as I prepared to say the one thing I had avoided my entire life, I understood that the next few seconds would reveal something important, not just about him, but about who I was willing to be from this moment forward, and whether I was finally ready to step out of the role I had been quietly trapped in for years. When I finally spoke, I didn't rush into explanations or defenses, because for once I didn't feel the need to soften the truth, and that alone felt unfamiliar, almost rebellious, and I said his name slowly, the way I used to when he was younger and needed to listen. And there was a brief pause on the other end, like he sensed something had changed, and I realized how rare that was for him to notice my tone instead of his own urgency. And I told him I needed him to hear me, not react, just hear me. And for a moment he went quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't patience but confusion, because he was used to reassurance, not resistance. And I felt my heart thump hard in my chest as I said what I had been circling around for days, that I wasn't upset about the wedding anymore, that the pain of not being invited had already settled into something dull and heavy, and that what mattered now was something deeper, something he needed to understand if we were ever going to speak honestly again. And I told him that asking me for that money, after everything, forced me to finally see how he viewed me. not as someone to protect, but as someone to lean on without looking back. And I could hear his breath change through the phone, sharper now, defensive, and he tried to interrupt, tried to explain again. Tried to bring the conversation back to urgency and timelines, but I didn't let him, all because this was the first time I wasn't stepping aside to make space for his comfort. And I told him that I had spent my life making sure he never felt alone, never felt unsupported, never felt unsafe, and that I had done it willingly, lovingly, without regret. But that love didn't mean erasing myself when it became inconvenient, and for a second there was nothing but silence, and I wondered if the words were landing or if they were just passing through him like noise, and then his voice returned. Tight and frustrated, asking why I was making this so complicated, saying families help each other, saying I was overthinking things, and that's when it hit me, not with anger but with clarity. Because helping isn't the same as sacrificing your future without question, and I told him that if he had called me before the wedding, if he had been honest, if he had treated me like someone who mattered. This conversation might have been different, but calling after, when the celebration was over and the bill was due, made everything feel transactional. And I could hear the disbelief in his voice as he asked if I was really going to bring the wedding into this, and I almost laughed, ha ha ha, because he still didn't see it. He still thought the money existed separately from the hurt. And I realized then that this wasn't just about money or respect. It was about accountability, something he had been protected from for a long time, and I told him that I wasn't refusing to help out of spite. I was refusing because I needed him to understand that my life, my security, my future mattered too, and that I couldn't keep proving my love by putting myself last. And that was the moment his tone changed completely. The urgency slipping into irritation, irritation into accusation, and he asked if I was really willing to let everything fall apart over money, and that question hurt more than I expected. Because it showed how deeply he misunderstood the situation, how easily he reduced years of sacrifice and weeks of pain into a single number, and I took a deep breath before answering, because I wanted my words to be clear. And I told him that what would make everything fall apart wasn't my refusal, it was the assumption that I would always clean up the mess without being considered part of the family when it mattered, and I felt a strange sadness as I said it. Because I wasn't trying to hurt him, I was trying to wake him up, and for a brief moment, there was silence again, heavier this time, and I wondered if he was finally seeing what I had been trying to say, or if he was just calculating his next move. And as that pause stretched on, I realized something else, something quiet but powerful, that no matter how this conversation ended, I had already crossed a line I could never go back over. Because once you speak the truth out loud, you can't pretend you didn't see it. And as I waited for his response, listening to the faint background noise on his end, I knew the next thing he said would tell me everything I needed to know. Not about the money, not about the wedding, but about whether he was capable of seeing me as more than a solution, or if this was the moment I finally accepted that some lessons are learned only when help is withheld. The silence on the line stretched longer than I expected, ha ha ha, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, long enough for me to realize that this was the first time I wasn't afraid of what he might say next. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, not calmer, just sharper, edged with disbelief, like someone realizing a door they always assumed was unlocked had just been shut, and he asked me if I was serious. If I really meant what I was saying, and I answered without hesitation, because clarity does that to you, it removes the need for drama, and I told him yes, I meant every word, and there was a pause, followed by a laugh that wasn't amused. More incredulous ha-ha-ha, like he couldn't quite process that I wasn't backing down, and then he said it, the thing that finally pulled the curtain back. He said I was being emotional, that this wasn't the time to make a point. That real adults handle problems instead of holding onto feelings, and something about that sentence made me feel unexpectedly calm, because suddenly the confusion was gone and I understood exactly where we stood. And I told him I wasn't being emotional, I was being honest, and that honesty only feels dramatic when it interrupts entitlement. And his breathing grew heavier, the frustration spilling through now, and he started listing consequences. Deadlines, pressure from other people, all the reasons why my refusal would cause trouble, and I listened quietly because I needed him to hear himself, and when he finally stopped, I said the words I hadn't planned. The words that came from somewhere deeper than fear or guilt. I told him I wasn't paying the money, not now, not later, not in pieces, and I could almost hear his grip tighten on the phone, and he asked why again. As if the answer might change, and that's when I said it calmly, clearly, without raising my voice. I told him I guess I forgot to tell you something, and he went silent, completely silent, and I felt my chest tighten. Because I knew that sentence carried weight, and I continued before he could interrupt, telling him that I wasn't part of the wedding, so I wouldn't be part of the bill, that I wasn't important enough to witness the joy. so I wouldn't be responsible for the cost, and my voice didn't shake as I said it, because the truth had steadied me, and I told him that my money wasn't a backup plan, it was my future. And I wasn't willing to trade it for approval that only appeared when something went wrong. And there it was, the sound I hadn't expected, a sharp intake of breath, like he was finally realizing this wasn't a negotiation. And he accused me of abandoning him, of choosing money over family, and that accusation hurt. But it didn't break me, because I recognized it for what it was, fear disguised as blame. And I told him quietly that I wasn't abandoning him, I was refusing to abandon myself, and that if he wanted help, real help, it would start with honesty, accountability, and respect, not urgency and guilt. And there was nothing left to say after that, because the truth had been spoken, and I ended the call gently, without slamming the phone down, without dramatic final words, just a simple goodbye, and when the line went dead. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the dark screen, tears finally slipping down my face, not because I felt weak, but because I felt free, sigh, and I realized that whatever happened next, whatever consequences followed, I had just done something I had never done before. I had chosen myself. And as I wiped my eyes and set the phone aside, a strange calm settled over the room. The kind that only comes after a storm breaks, and I knew this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot, because when you stop fixing other people's problems, you force them to face realities they've been avoiding. And as I sat there in the quiet, I understood that the fallout from this decision was only beginning, and the next call, whenever it came, would change things in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The days that followed felt strangely unreal, like walking through a familiar place after all the furniture has been moved, everything recognizable but nothing quite where you expect it to be. And the silence that filled the house wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, humming with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. And at first I kept expecting my phone to ring again, expecting anger, panic, bargaining, anything. Because that's what usually comes after you say no for the first time. But the silence held long and heavy, sigh, and I realized how much of my life had been shaped around reacting to his needs, because without them, my days felt oddly open, unsettled, and I didn't know what to do with that freedom yet. And I moved through my routine slowly, drinking tea, opening windows, letting light into rooms I hadn't noticed were dark. And I felt waves of emotion come and go without warning, relief followed by guilt, then relief again, like my heart was recalibrating itself after years of being pulled in one direction, and I would catch myself thinking about him, wondering how he was handling it, whether he was angry or scared or finally reflecting. And each time that thought surfaced, I reminded myself that his reaction wasn't my responsibility anymore. Because that was the hardest habit to break, the instinct to manage his feelings so he wouldn't have to. And a few days later, the first message came, not a call, just a short text, sharp and cold, accusing me of being heartless, of turning my back when he needed me most, and reading it made my chest ache, because no matter how clear you are, being misunderstood by your own child cuts deep. And I cried then, quietly, letting the tears come without judging them. Because strength doesn't mean numbness, it means letting yourself feel without letting those feelings control your choices. And I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because there was nothing left to explain. And over the next few days, more messages followed, some angry, some desperate, some strangely polite, like he was testing different versions of himself to see which one might unlock the old response from me. And each time I felt that familiar pull to rescue, to soothe, to fix, and each time I resisted, reminding myself that rescuing him now would only teach him that my boundaries were temporary, and that realization was painful. Because it meant accepting that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone experience the weight of their own decisions. And gradually, the messages slowed, the urgency faded, replaced by a silence that felt different from before, heavier but more honest. And in that quiet, I started noticing changes in myself, small but meaningful ones, like how I slept through the night without waking up anxious, how I laughed more easily at small things, how I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, and I realized how much tension I had been carrying without even knowing it. And one afternoon, as I sat by the window watching people walk by, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer pretending, and that peace felt fragile but real, like the beginning of something new. And then, one evening, the phone rang again, and this time I knew it would be different, because the sound of it didn't fill me with dread or urgency, it just felt like information. And when I answered, his voice sounded tired, stripped of its sharp edges, and he didn't start with demands or accusations. He just said my name softly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and in that silence I could hear something I hadn't heard before. Humility, and he told me things had fallen apart faster than he expected, that people who promised support disappeared, that the pressure he tried to avoid by excluding me had finally caught up with him, and as I listened, I felt sadness for him, real sadness, because I never wanted his life to be hard, but I also felt something else, resolve, because I knew stepping in now to absorb the consequences wouldn't save him, it would only delay his growth. And when he asked if we could talk, really talk, not about money, not about fixing anything, just talk, I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood that conversation would only matter if it was honest. And I told him we could talk, but not until he was ready to see me as more than a safety net. And there was a long pause, followed by a quiet, I understand, and I don't know if he truly did. But it was the first time he didn't argue, and when the call ended, I sat there feeling both heavy and hopeful, because something had shifted, not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough to change the direction of things. And I realized that choosing myself didn't mean I stopped loving him, it meant I loved myself enough to stop disappearing. And as the night settled around me, I felt a sense of closure beginning to form, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally reclaimed my place in my own life, and I knew that whatever happened next, whatever future awaited us, I would no longer be paying the price for being someone's silent solution, and that understanding, more than any apology or outcome, was the true turning point of this story. By the time I truly understood what had happened, the noise around it had faded, ha ha ha, not because everything was forgiven or fixed, but because clarity has a way of quieting chaos once it settles in. And I found myself sitting alone one evening, the house wrapped in a soft stillness, thinking about how strange it was that the most painful moments of our lives often arrive disguised as endings, when in reality they're beginnings we didn't ask for. And I thought about him, about the boy he used to be, the one who once ran toward me instead of away, the one who believed my presence was enough. And I let myself grieve that version of him without trying to rescue the man he had become. Sigh, because grief doesn't mean regret, it just means honesty. And I realized that the hardest lesson I had learned through all of this wasn't about money or weddings or boundaries. It was about identity, about how easily we can lose ourselves when love becomes something we perform instead of something we live. And I saw clearly how long I had measured my worth through usefulness, through sacrifice, through how much discomfort I could endure without complaint, and how quietly that habit had trained others to expect less respect from me. And that realization stung, but it also felt strangely empowering. Because once you see the pattern, you can choose differently, and I began choosing differently in small ways, like saying no without explaining myself, like resting without guilt, like letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. And those small choices started stacking up, reshaping my days in ways I hadn't expected, and I noticed how my thoughts softened, how my body relaxed, how my laughter came easier. And I understood that peace doesn't arrive when people finally treat you right. It arrives when you stop accepting treatment that feels wrong. And somewhere in that quiet transformation, I stopped waiting for apologies that might never come. Because I realized that waiting kept me tied to the same dynamic I had already stepped away from. And I thought about the wedding again, not with bitterness this time, but with perspective. Because being excluded had spared me from something I no longer wanted to be part of, a world built on appearances, urgency, and entitlement. And I felt a strange gratitude for the clarity it forced on me. Because if I had been invited, if I had smiled through the ceremony and paid the bill afterward, I might have stayed stuck in the same role forever. And that thought made me shiver, ha ha ha, because sometimes rejection is protection in disguise. And as days turned into weeks, I found myself reclaiming pieces of my life I hadn't realized I had abandoned, like making plans without checking anyone else's schedule, like dreaming again without tying those dreams to someone else's approval. And I understood that love doesn't disappear when you draw boundaries. It simply changes shape, and whether or not he ever fully understood my decision. I knew I had done the right thing, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, and I made peace with the fact that growth doesn't always happen together. Sometimes it happens apart, and that doesn't mean the love was fake. It just means it evolved unevenly, and I sat with that truth without trying to fix it, because fixing had never been my responsibility alone. And one afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the floor and the house felt warm instead of empty, I caught myself smiling for no reason, just breathing, just existing, and I realized how long it had been since I allowed myself that simple joy. And I thought about all the people listening to stories like this, people who love deeply and give freely and wonder why they feel unseen, and I wanted to tell them something I wish someone had told me earlier. That love should not cost you your dignity, that family should not require self-erasure, that helping someone grow sometimes means stepping back instead of leaning in, and that choosing yourself is not abandonment, it's survival. And if you're hearing this and feeling that quiet ache of recognition, know this: you're not cruel for setting limits, You're not selfish for protecting your future, and you're not wrong for wanting to be valued without conditions. And I'll say this once more before I end, because it matters. Stories like this aren't about winning or losing. They're about waking up, and waking up changes everything. So if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or rethink something in your own life, stay connected. Subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes hearing the truth spoken out loud gives us permission to finally live it. And as I look back now, I don't see a mother who was rejected. I see a woman who finally chose herself, and that choice, quiet and firm, was the moment my life truly began.